Anthony Hanks thought he'd found paradise when his Filipino bride Feliz welcomed him into her family with open arms. He believed he was investing in their future together in the Philippines. What started as love letters from Cebu City would end with a devastating revelation that shattered everything he believed about trust, family, and the difference between being needed and being loved. Anthony Hanks pressed his face against the cold window of his Phoenix apartment, watching his neighbor's grandchildren play in the courtyard below. At 68, his own grandchildren lived thousands of miles away, and his phone hadn't rung in 3 weeks. The silence in his small retirement home felt like a prison sentence. His weathered fingers moved across the laptop keyboard, scrolling through dating profiles of women half his age who wanted nothing to do with a retired construction worker. Then her message appeared like a bright star in a dark sky. "Hello, Anthony. Your smile reminds me of my late father. You seem like a man with stories to tell." The woman in the photo had kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her name was Feliz de la Cruz, and she lived in a place called Cebu City in the Philippines. Unlike the other women who asked about his income in their first message, Feliz wanted to know about his dreams. "I built houses for 30 years, Anthony typed back, his heart beating faster than it had in months. "Now I'm looking for someone to build a life with." Their first video call lasted until sunrise. Feliz sat in what looked like a small kitchen, morning light streaming through bamboo curtains. She spoke slowly, choosing her English words carefully, telling him about teaching children at a local school and caring for her elderly mother. "In my country, we believe that love grows slowly, like rice in the fields," she said, her voice soft and musical. "American men always seem to be in such a hurry." Anthony found himself laughing for the first time in years. "Maybe that's why my first marriage didn't work out. I was always rushing to the next job, the next deadline." As weeks turned into months, their daily conversations became the highlight of Anthony's existence. Feliz would call him after her teaching day ended, and he would wake up early just to catch her before she started cooking dinner for her family. She told him about the chaos of jeepney rides to school, the smell of street food vendors, and the sound of tropical rain on tin roofs. "My mother asks about you every day," Feliz mentioned during one call, adjusting her phone so he could see the small shrine in the corner of her room. "She says any man who makes her daughter smile like this must have a good heart." Anthony began sending small gifts, a package of American chocolates, a photo of the Arizona desert, a simple necklace he found at the local mall. Each gift was met with photos of Feliz wearing the necklace or sharing the chocolates with neighborhood children. But doubt crept in during sleepless nights. Why would a woman like Feliz, who could have any man in her city, want a retired American with creaky knees and gray hair? His ex-wife had left him for a younger man. His own children barely called anymore. "You're overthinking this, old man," he told his reflection in the bathroom mirror. "Maybe she just sees something in you that others don't." The turning point came when Feliz's school closed due to flooding. She called him crying, explaining that without her teaching income, her family couldn't afford her mother's heart medication. "I hate to burden you with our problems," she said, tears streaming down her face on the video call. "I know we haven't met in person yet, but I feel so close to you." Anthony didn't hesitate. He walked to Western Union that same afternoon and sent $500. When Feliz called him back that evening, her joy was infectious. "You saved my mother's life," she whispered. "How can I ever repay such kindness?" "You don't need to repay anything," Anthony replied. "That's what people do for each other when they care." But something changed after that first money transfer. Feliz's family began appearing more often in their video calls. Her sister Carmen would wave shyly from the background. Her mother, Nene Rosa, would insist on blessing Anthony through the screen in broken English. "My family already considers you part of us," Feliz explained one evening. In Filipino culture, when someone helps the family, they become family. Anthony felt a warmth he hadn't experienced since his children were young. Here was a woman who valued his kindness over his bank account, who appreciated his stories instead of judging his age. As their relationship deepened, Feliz began sharing her dreams. She wanted to open a small sari-sari store to help support her community. She dreamed of a house with a garden where she could grow vegetables. Most importantly, she wanted a partner who understood that love meant taking care of each other. "I've been alone for so long," Anthony admitted during one late-night call. "Sometimes I wonder if I remember how to be part of a family." "Love is like riding a bicycle," Feliz replied with a gentle smile. "Once you learn, you never forget. You just need someone to trust you with their heart." The decision to visit the Philippines came naturally. Anthony had vacation money saved up, and Feliz's excitement about showing him her world was contagious. As he booked his flight, a small voice in his head whispered warnings about online scams and foreign women who preyed on lonely American men. But when Feliz sent him a video of her entire neighborhood preparing welcome signs with his name, those doubts evaporated like morning mist. The plane touched down in Cebu just as the sun painted the sky pink and orange. Anthony's shirt was already soaked with sweat before he reached the immigration line, but his heart raced with anticipation rather than anxiety. Somewhere beyond those glass doors, Feliz was waiting for him. The airport buzzed with organized chaos, families reuniting, taxi drivers shouting destinations, and the warm smell of tropical air mixing with jet fuel. Anthony scanned the crowd of faces, suddenly wondering if he would recognize the woman he'd fallen in love with through a computer screen. Then he saw her, and his breath caught in his throat. Feliz stood near the exit barrier, more beautiful than any photo could capture, holding a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Anthony," in colorful letters. Her smile could have powered the entire airport. "Anthony!" She rushed toward him as he cleared customs, and her embrace felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. She smelled like sampaguita flowers and promises of adventure. "You're really here," she whispered against his chest. "I was so afraid this was all a dream." The jeepney ride to her barangay opened Anthony's eyes to a world he'd only seen in travel documentaries. Vendors sold fresh fruit from wooden carts, children played soccer in narrow streets, and music spilled from every doorway. Feliz pointed out landmarks with the pride of someone showing off a beloved family member. "That's where I buy the best mangoes," she said, squeezing his hand. "And there's the church where I pray for you every Sunday." Her house was smaller than his apartment back home, but it overflowed with warmth and laughter. Nene Rosa, Feliz's mother, greeted him with tears in her eyes and a string of rapid Tagalog that needed no translation. Carmen, Feliz's younger sister, giggled behind her hands but served him fresh coconut juice with careful attention. "They've been preparing for weeks," Feliz explained as neighbors gathered in the small living room to meet the American visitor. "In our culture, welcoming family is the highest honor." That first week passed like a beautiful dream. Feliz took him to Bohol Beach, where they watched the sunset paint the water gold and purple. They visited the Chocolate Hills, where Anthony marveled at the rolling landscape that looked like something from another planet. In bustling Colon Street, the oldest street in the Philippines, they shared halo halo and she taught him basic Tagalog phrases. "Mahal kita" means I love you, she said, her cheeks blushing pink. "But only say it when you really mean it." Anthony found himself falling deeper in love not just with Feliz, but with her entire world. The way vendors remembered her name, how children from her school ran up to hug her on the street, the respect her neighbors showed her. Everything painted a picture of a woman deeply rooted in her community. But he also noticed things that tugged at his heartstrings. The family's refrigerator was nearly empty. Carmen's school uniform had been carefully mended multiple times. Nene Rosa coughed frequently but waved away suggestions about seeing a doctor. "We manage," Feliz said when Anthony gently asked about their struggles. "Filipino families always find a way." During his second week, Anthony met Feliz's extended family at a gathering that seemed to include half the neighborhood. Her uncle Mang Ben worked as a tricycle driver, saving every peso for his daughter's college tuition. Her cousin Aunt Lisa had just lost her job at a factory closure. Her nephew Jojo, barely 16, already worked part-time to help support his siblings. Despite their financial struggles, they treated Anthony like royalty. They cooked elaborate meals they couldn't afford, bought cases of San Miguel beer for his enjoyment, and insisted on taking him to expensive tourist spots. "Please, you don't need to spend your money on me," Anthony protested when Mang Ben wanted to hire a van for a trip to Temple of Leah. "You are family now," Mang Ben replied through Feliz's translation. "Family takes care of family." The proposal happened naturally, as if the universe had been steering them toward that moment since their first video call. They were walking along the Malacon waterfront, watching cargo ships drift toward the horizon, when Anthony felt the ring box burning a hole in his pocket. "Feliz," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I know this might seem fast, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." When he dropped to one knee on the concrete walkway, a crowd of strangers began cheering before he even opened the ring box. Feliz's tears fell like tropical rain, and her yes was drowned out by applause from dozens of people they'd never met. In the Philippines, when someone gets engaged, the whole community celebrates, she explained later as neighbors brought them flowers and small gifts. Your happiness becomes everyone's happiness. Planning the wedding became a community project. Feliz's church friends offered to provide flowers from their gardens. Local musicians volunteered to play during the ceremony. Even the neighborhood baker insisted on donating the wedding cake. "I want to pay for everything," Anthony insisted, overwhelmed by their generosity. "It's the least I can do." "If you insist on paying, at least let us organize," Feliz replied. "Filipino weddings are complicated, but we know how to make them beautiful." As wedding preparations accelerated, Anthony began to understand the true meaning of Filipino hospitality. Every expense was discussed as a family decision. Every vendor was someone's cousin or neighbor. Every detail was handled with the care of people who understood that weddings weren't just about two people, but about two communities joining together. The night before the wedding, Anthony sat on Feliz's small porch, listening to the evening sounds of the barangay children playing, mothers calling their families to dinner, the distant sound of karaoke from a neighbor's celebration. "Are you nervous?" Feliz asked, sitting beside him and taking his weathered hand in her smooth one. "Not nervous," Anthony replied honestly, "just amazed. 6 months ago, I was eating dinner alone every night. Tomorrow, I'll be married to the most wonderful woman I've ever met, surrounded by more family than I knew was possible." The wedding day dawned bright and clear, with just enough clouds to keep the temperature comfortable. As Anthony stood at the altar of the small Catholic church, watching Feliz walk down the aisle in her simple white dress, he felt like the luckiest man in the world. But as he slipped the ring onto her finger and promised to love and protect her family as his own, Anthony had no idea that those same words would soon become the foundation of his destruction. The electricity bill arrived on a Tuesday morning that started like paradise and ended like a nightmare. Anthony sat in their small kitchen, sipping coffee made from beans Feliz bought at the local market, watching roosters strut through their backyard garden. 6 months of married life in the Philippines had felt like living inside a postcard, until he opened that yellow envelope. "Mahal, we have a problem," Feliz said, her voice trembling as she set the bill on their bamboo table. The amount was 3 times higher than usual, and Anthony's social security check wouldn't arrive for another week. But before he could worry about electricity, Feliz's phone rang with news that made the power bill seem like pocket change. Nene Rosa had collapsed at the neighborhood clinic, and the doctor was demanding immediate payment for emergency tests. "They won't treat her without money up front," Feliz cried, clutching Anthony's arm. "The doctor says her heart is failing, and she needs surgery in Manila. 50,000 pesos or she could die." Anthony didn't hesitate. Within an hour, he was at the Western Union office, wiring $15,000 from his retirement account. The relief on Feliz's face made every penny feel worth it, and Nene Rosa's grateful tears when they visited her in the hospital melted his heart completely. "You are more than a son-in-law," the elderly woman whispered in broken English, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. "You are my savior." But the medical emergency was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, Carmen appeared at their doorstep with red eyes and a crumpled letter in her hands. "The nursing school raised their tuition," she explained through sobs. "If I can't pay by Friday, they'll give my spot to someone else. I've worked so hard for this dream." Feliz translated rapidly between English and Tagalog as Carmen explained how competitive nursing programs were, how this opportunity might never come again, how the family's future depended on having a nurse who could work overseas and send money home. Another $10,000 flowed from Anthony's account to secure Carmen's education. The young woman's joy was infectious, and her promise to repay him someday felt sincere and heartfelt. Then came the roof repairs. The rainy season arrived with a vengeance, and their small house leaked like a broken bucket. Water dripped into pots scattered across their bedroom floor, and the constant ping-ping-ping kept Anthony awake at night. "The whole roof needs replacing," explained Mang Ben, Felice's uncle, as he climbed down from his inspection. "The wood is rotten, and the metal sheets are rusted through. If we don't fix it now, the whole ceiling could collapse." $8,000 later, their house had a new roof that gleamed silver in the afternoon sun. But Anthony noticed that his bank balance was starting to look smaller each time he checked it. The medical bills kept coming. Nene Rosa needed special medications that weren't available in Cebu. Felice's aunt in Manila required treatment for diabetes. A distant cousin's child needed emergency surgery after a motorcycle accident. Each crisis arrived with tears, desperate phone calls, and family meetings conducted entirely in rapid Tagalog that Anthony couldn't follow. In Filipino families, when one person suffers, everyone suffers, Felice explained after each new request for help. And when one person can help, everyone expects them to help. Anthony began to understand the weight of being the family's financial lifeline. Every celebration, every crisis, every opportunity seemed to require his involvement. When Carmen graduated from her nursing program, the family threw a party that cost $3,000. When Felice's nephew got married, tradition demanded that they contribute to the wedding expenses. "It's an investment in our relationships," Felice assured him as they handed another envelope of cash to yet another family member. In Filipino culture, generosity creates bonds that last forever. But those bonds were becoming expensive. Anthony started calculating his spending during sleepless nights, listening to tropical rain drum against their new roof. In 18 months, he had spent nearly $80,000 on family emergencies, education, medical bills, and celebrations. Still, the requests kept coming with the regularity of the afternoon thunderstorms. Felice's brother needed money to start a small business. Her cousin required funds to fix his tricycle so he could keep working. The neighborhood school needed donations for new textbooks. "Sometimes I feel like an ATM machine," Anthony confided to Felice one evening as they sat on their small porch, watching children play in the street. "What's an ATM machine?" she asked, genuinely confused. "Never mind," he replied, realizing that even his complaints were lost in translation. The first real warning sign came when Anthony tried to access his investment account online. The internet connection in their barangay was slow and unreliable, cutting out whenever it rained hard. After 3 frustrating hours at the local internet cafe, he finally logged in to discover that his retirement fund had shrunk to less than half its original size. "This can't be right," he muttered, staring at the screen in disbelief. The numbers seemed impossible, like a mathematical error that would surely be corrected. But the numbers were correct. Every wire transfer, every Western Union payment, every emergency withdrawal had been carefully recorded by the bank. His lifetime of savings was disappearing faster than ice cream in the Philippine heat. That night, Anthony lay awake calculating and recalculating. At this rate, his money would be completely gone within a year. But every time he considered talking to Felice about cutting back on family support, another crisis would arise that seemed too urgent to ignore. The breaking point came when Felice announced that her youngest sister needed surgery to remove her appendix, and the family had already borrowed as much as they could from neighbors and relatives. "We've asked everyone we know," Felice said, tears streaming down her face. "You're our last hope. Without this surgery, she could die from infection." Anthony found himself at the Western Union office again, sending another $8,000 overseas. But this time, something felt different. The clerk behind the counter gave him a look that seemed almost pitying, as if she'd seen this story play out many times before. Walking home through the crowded streets of Cebu, Anthony began noticing things he'd ignored before. Other aging foreign men sitting alone in restaurants, looking lost and broke. Filipino women arguing with bank tellers about failed money transfers. Western Union offices that seemed to operate like assembly lines, processing the financial dreams and disasters of international relationships. When he arrived home, he found Feliz on the phone with her sister, speaking in rapid, excited Tagalog. She looked up at him with shining eyes and mouthed "thank you" before returning to her conversation. But for the first time since arriving in the Philippines, Anthony didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a very long fall. The internet cafe smelled like instant coffee and broken dreams when Anthony finally gathered the courage to check his bank accounts on a sweltering Thursday morning. His hands shook as he typed in his password, and what he saw on the screen made his vision blur with panic and disbelief. $340,000. Gone. His entire life savings reduced to a number that wouldn't cover a month's rent back in Phoenix. The teenagers around him played online games and laughed at videos, completely unaware that a man's entire future had just crumbled in the chair next to them. Anthony stared at the screen until his eyes burned, hoping the numbers would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. He stumbled out of the cafe and into the blazing afternoon heat, his chest tight and his breathing shallow. Cars honked, vendors shouted, and life continued its chaotic dance around him while his world fell apart in slow motion. At home, Feliz was in the kitchen with Carmen and two women he'd never seen before, all chattering in animated Tagalog while cooking what smelled like a feast. The conversation stopped abruptly when he walked through the door, for pairs of eyes turning toward him with expressions he couldn't read. "Mahal, you look pale," Feliz said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Are you feeling sick from the heat?" "We need to talk," Anthony said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Alone." The kitchen emptied quickly, with Carmen and the strangers finding sudden reasons to visit neighbors. Feliz sat across from him at their small table, her face already showing the worry lines that appeared whenever serious conversations began. "The money is gone," Anthony said simply. "All of it." Feliz blinked several times, as if trying to translate words that didn't make sense. "What money, Mahal?" "My retirement fund. My savings. Everything I worked 40 years to build. It's gone." The silence stretched between them like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter. Outside, children played and motorcycles puttered past. But inside their small kitchen, the world had stopped moving. "But we've been careful," Feliz said finally. "We only used money for emergencies." Anthony pulled out a notebook where he'd been tracking their expenses and spread the pages across the table. "Your mother's surgery, $15,000. Carmen's school, $10,000. The roof, $8,000. Your sister's appendix surgery, $8,000. His finger moved down the list like a judge reading a sentence. 47 different emergencies in 18 months. Feliz's face grew paler with each number. "These were all necessary expenses, Mahal. Family obligations. 47 emergencies. Feliz. That's one every 2 weeks for a year and a half." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it automatically, and Anthony watched her expression change from confusion to something he'd never seen before: calculation. "Who's texting you?" he asked. "My cousin from Davao," she said, not meeting his eyes. "She knows a nice American man who's looking for a Filipino wife." The words hit Anthony like a physical blow. "What?" Feliz stood up from the table, her posture straightening into something formal and distant. "Anthony, you've been very generous to my family. We're grateful for everything you've done." "Grateful?" The word came out like a strangled laugh. "Feliz, I'm your husband." "Yes, but..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What can you offer my family now? You have no money left. No income except your small social security. My family still has needs." Through the kitchen window, Anthony could see Carmen loading suitcases into a tricycle. In the distance, Nene Rosa was arguing with a neighbor, gesturing toward their house with angry hand movements. "How long have you been planning this?" Anthony asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Planning what?" Feliz replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "The emergencies. The constant crises. The timing of every family disaster right after my pension checks arrived. Felice's mask finally slipped completely. My family has real problems, Anthony. Real needs. We didn't create emergencies. We just knew when to ask for help. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The medical bills he'd never seen receipts for. The school tuition for programs that Carmen had somehow completed in record time. The relatives who needed surgery but were somehow healthy enough to attend family parties just weeks later. The appendix surgery, Anthony said slowly. Was that even real? Felice looked away. My sister did need surgery. Just not as urgently as we said. And your mother's heart medication? She does have heart problems. But the expensive medication you paid for, the cheaper version works just as well. Anthony felt like he was drowning in revelations. The roof repairs? Carmen's education? Your uncle's tricycle. All real expenses, Felice said defensively. We never lied about needing the money. We just emphasized the urgency. The full scope of his naivety crashed over him like a tsunami. Every tears-filled phone call, every desperate plea for help, every family meeting conducted in Tagalog he couldn't understand. All of it had been carefully orchestrated to extract maximum sympathy and financial support. You never loved me, Anthony said, though it came out more as a statement than a question. I cared for you, Felice replied. You're a kind man, Anthony, but love and practicality are different things. My family needed security, and you provided it. And now that the money's gone, the American from Davao owns 3 businesses and just bought a new house in Alabang. He's looking for a wife who understands family obligations. Anthony watched his wife pack her belongings with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Her movements were quick and purposeful, no hesitation or backward glances. Will you tell him the same stories? Anthony asked. About family emergencies and urgent medical bills? Felice paused in her packing. He's younger than you, Anthony. Stronger. He can provide for a family for many more years. The brutal honesty was almost refreshing after months of manufactured crises. Anthony sat in their kitchen, surrounded by the life they'd built together, and realized that none of it had ever been real. That night, he lay alone on their bed, listening to Felice pack in the other room, and faced the most devastating truth of his 68 years. He hadn't been a husband, he'd been a business investment that had finally run dry. The love he thought he'd found had been as carefully constructed as a movie set, beautiful from the front but hollow behind the facade. And now that the money was gone, the performance was over. 6 months after Felice walked out of his life, Anthony Hanks sat in his modest studio apartment near the University of San Carlos, grading English papers by the soft glow of a desk lamp. The humid evening air drifted through his open window, carrying the familiar sounds of Cebu City, jeepneys rumbling past, vendors calling out their wares, and the distant laughter of children playing in the narrow streets below. His weathered hands moved steadily across the pages, marking corrections with the patience of a man who had finally learned to appreciate small victories. Maria's essay about her dreams of becoming a nurse showed remarkable improvement in her grammar. Carlos had written a touching piece about his father's sacrifice to send him to school. These young Filipinos, hungry for education and opportunity, reminded Anthony daily that worth couldn't be measured in bank account balances. The knock on his door came just as he was finishing the last paper. Anthony glanced at the clock, 9:30 on a Sunday evening. Late for visitors in his quiet neighborhood. Felice stood in the hallway, thinner than he remembered, wearing a simple dress that had seen better days. Her eyes, once bright with calculated warmth, now carried the hollow look of someone whose carefully laid plans had crumbled. Anthony, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. May I come in? He stepped aside without speaking, gesturing toward the small plastic chair near his desk. His apartment was sparse but clean. A single bed, a tiny refrigerator, and shelves lined with English textbooks and student papers. The contrast to their former home couldn't have been more stark. Felice sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap like a penitent child. I made a mistake, she began, the words tumbling out in a rush. The man from Davao. He wasn't what I expected. Anthony remained standing, leaning against his desk with his arms crossed. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid during their marriage. He was married, Felice continued, her voice cracking slightly. His wife lives in America, and he was just looking for entertainment while she was away. When she found out about me, he threw me out with nothing. She told him about the months that followed, staying with relatives who barely tolerated her presence, working as a sales clerk in a department store for wages that barely covered food, watching her family's debts multiply as their American benefactor disappeared from their lives. "We lost the house," she said, tears beginning to flow. "The one you helped us buy. My mother is living with my aunt now, and Carmen had to drop out of nursing school. Everything fell apart after you left." Anthony listened without interruption, studying the woman who had once been the center of his universe. He saw clearly now what he had missed before, the lines of stress around her eyes, the calculated way she presented her problems, the careful timing of every revelation designed to maximize emotional impact. "I was wrong about you," Felice said, looking up at him with desperate eyes. "You're a good man, Anthony. You loved my family like they were your own. I threw away something precious for the promise of something that was never real." "You're right," Anthony said quietly. "I did love your family. I would have given them anything, and I did give them everything. But you didn't want my love, Felice. You wanted my utility." The words came out without anger or bitterness, just the calm clarity of a man who had finally seen through the fog of his own desperation. "I know that now," Felice whispered. "But people can change. I can change. We could start over, rebuild what we had." Anthony walked to his window, looking out at the city lights that sparkled like fallen stars across the darkened landscape. Below, an elderly Filipino man was closing his small sari-sari store, carefully counting the day's modest earnings before pulling down the metal shutters. "What we had was never real," Anthony said, his voice gentle but firm. "It was a beautiful performance, Felice. You played the role of the loving wife and I played the role of the generous provider. But neither of us was being genuine." He turned back to face her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Felice saw something in his expression that made her hope falter. It wasn't anger or hurt, it was something far more final. "Peace. I spent my whole life believing that love was about what I could provide," Anthony continued. "What I could fix, what I could give, how useful I could be to other people. You didn't create that belief, you just exploited it very skillfully." "Anthony, please dash. I'm not angry with you anymore," he said, cutting her off gently. "I understand now that you were doing what you thought you needed to do to survive, to take care of your family. In your position, facing the same pressures, many people would have made similar choices." He sat down across from her, his movements deliberate and calm. "But understanding your choices doesn't mean I'm willing to repeat my own mistakes." "What mistakes?" Felice asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "I confused being needed with being valued. I thought that if I could solve everyone's problems, if I could be indispensable, then I would be loved. But real love isn't transactional, Felice. It doesn't come with emergency medical bills and urgent family crises." The truth hung in the air between them like morning mist, clear and inescapable. Felice's tears fell silently now, no longer the carefully timed emotional displays Anthony remembered, but the genuine grief of a woman facing the consequences of her choices. "I do love you," she said, her voice barely audible. "Maybe not the way I should have, but there were moments when it was real." "I believe you," Anthony replied, and meant it. But love without respect, without honesty, without genuine partnership, that's not enough anymore. "I can't save you, Felice. I can't save anyone except myself." He stood and walked to his small kitchen, returning with a glass of water that he offered to her. The simple gesture carried more kindness than all the money he had ever sent to her family. "What will you do now?" she asked, accepting the water with trembling hands. "I'll keep teaching," Anthony said. "I'll write letters to my children in America, real letters. not the desperate calls of a lonely man trying to prove his worth. I'll build a life here that's modest but honest. And us? There is no us, Feliz. There never really was. But I forgive you, and I hope you can forgive yourself. After she left, Anthony returned to his desk and picked up the last ungraded paper. It was an essay by a student named Joseph about overcoming disappointment. The young man wrote about failing his entrance exam to medical school and learning that setbacks could redirect you toward paths you never knew existed. Anthony smiled as he read the final paragraph. Sometimes the greatest gift is not getting what you thought you wanted, but discovering you are stronger than you knew when those dreams break apart. He wrote excellent work in the margin and added a smiley face, something he never would have done in his previous life, when he was too concerned with maintaining dignity and authority. The next morning, Anthony walked to the pier where cargo ships drifted like distant islands on the horizon. The sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and coral, and seagulls called to each other in voices that sounded almost conversational. An elderly Filipino man sat on the bench beside him, feeding breadcrumbs to the gathering birds. "Beautiful morning," the stranger said in accented English. "Yes," Anthony replied, meaning it completely. "It really is." He thought about his students, who valued his knowledge and patience without caring about his bank balance. He thought about the small apartment that was his alone, free from the constant pressure of manufactured emergencies. He thought about the peace that came from knowing exactly where he stood in the world. At 68, Anthony had finally learned the difference between being needed and being respected, between being used and being valued. The money was gone, the marriage was over, but what remained was somehow infinitely more valuable. A man who finally understood his own worth. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, and Anthony sat with the quiet contentment of someone who had discovered that the most important relationship he would ever have was the one with himself. Sometimes the greatest victory wasn't winning someone's love, but learning that you were complete without it.